Wish each of you a Shana Tova Umituka, a sweet and happy beginning to our new year. Nearly 70 years ago, on August 30th, 1952, Rabbi Goldberg of blessed memory was arrested in Albany, Georgia, for participating in an anti-segregation protest. 1 year later, in 1953, just weeks after Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, Rabbi Goldberg reflected on his arrest during his Rosh Hashanah sermon in this very sanctuary. Rabbi Goldberg wrote, "I was grateful to have put my religious principles to a test of action, yet I felt on my return that enough people in the congregation were disturbed by the arrest that I did not make racial justice the theme of my New Year's address. Looking backward," Rabbi Goldberg wrote, "I'm somewhat ashamed at my decision not to do so." I feel that same tension as Rabbi Goldberg. Given COVID and the intense divisions in our society, I am reticent to offer a sermon that some might deem political. I know that many of you have come tonight seeking comfort, perhaps even to forget about politics for a few hours. Yet when I look back next year, or in 10 years, or when Maggie and Aiden are grown, and ask how I responded to the great crises of our day, I do not want to feel shame at remaining silent. I do not wish to remain indifferent. Torah and history have taught again and again that, as Elie Wiesel is often quoted, the opposite of love is not hatred, it's indifference. Wiesel later wrote that, of course, indifference can be tempting, more than that, seductive. It is so much easier to look away from victims. It is so much easier to avoid rude interruptions to our work, our dreams, our hopes. Yet for the person who is indifferent, his or her neighbors are of no consequence. And therefore, their lives are meaningless. Their hidden or even visible anguish is of no interest. Indifference reduces the other to an abstraction. Today we have unlimited access to first-hand video and audio accounts of the horrors that people inflict upon their fellow. Yet it is so easy to turn our heads this way or that, to render our brothers and sisters meaningless. It should be unthinkable to us as Jews to not stand up and fight with our black and brown friends, neighbors, congregants, or family members when they are suffering. Later in his sermon, Rabbi Goldberg wrote on Rosh Hashanah, he wrote, "I am asking that we, with deep humility, join people of color in their struggle for a better nation. The Judaism to which we are heirs should have prompted us long ago to do this." 70 years later, we are now the inheritors of this struggle. A lot has changed for the good in the last 70 years. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act have emancipated people of color from many overtly racist systems of oppression. And yet covert racism has continued to oppress people of color to this very day. Policies that disproportionately affect people of color, some remnants of Jim Crow and others newly devised, are finally being discussed, if not directly addressed. These include racial disparities in our criminal justice system, drug laws, education funding, persistent segregation, voter suppression, and more. Rabbi Goldberg and Rabbi Brockman and many who came before us in our community engaged in these very struggles and inspired our congregation to become known as a bastion of love and acceptance. a congregation that lives our Jewish values by working with others to repair our world. It is now up to us to continue this work in order to make our world more equitable for all, so that everyone has access to the resources they need, no matter the color of their skin. Rabbi Goldberg also wrote in his sermon perhaps a line that caused strife for people. He wrote, "Perhaps we may redeem ourselves for our transgressions and our indifference by actively engaging ourselves as never before." That is why we are here tonight on Yom Kippur, to redeem ourselves from the transgressions and indifference from the years past. Teshuvah, repentance, is a continual process obligating us to reflect on the past in order to create a better future. Without examining our past actions individually and collectively, we are bound to repeat the same transgressions in the year to come. We look back not to feel guilty. Guilt is not going to change the past or the future. Yom Kippur is not a holiday that asks us to feel guilty. Instead, God challenges us to look forward. Instead of guilt, we can feel inspired, curious, energized, and excited by the possibility that each one of us can make our lives better for ourselves and for others. We have the opportunity to create a more peaceful, equitable, loving world than in the past. This is Yom Kippur's message of hope. During our prayers tonight, we asked forgiveness for the harm we caused both knowingly and unknowingly. We prayed for the harm we have caused in your world consciously and unconsciously. When we know what we have done wrong, we often know how to act differently. However, the only way that we can free ourselves from the harm that we caused unknowingly is to engage in cheshbon hanefesh. Cheshbon hanefesh is our sacred process of examining our actions from the past and learning how we may have caused harm in our world. Only then can we choose to be different. Only then can we choose to be better. Our confessional prayers then began, and when we turn to you, God, do not be indifferent. God, we are arrogant. We are stubborn. We claim to be blameless and free of sin. In truth, we have stumbled and strayed. We have done wrong. If we ask God not to be indifferent to us on Yom Kippur, we must not be indifferent to others. This idea of indifference is the very premise of Ibram Kendi's term anti-racist. Kendi writes that it isn't possible to be simply not racist. Kendi believes that all of us must choose a side. In fact, he believes that we are choosing all the time. Having spent many hours this summer protesting and, more importantly, learning from both white and black allies who devote their lives to racial justice, I believe Kendi's statement to be true. Through no fault of our own, but rather because of how deeply racism is ingrained in our society, each decision we make has racial consequences. Kendi teaches that indifference itself is a form of racism, echoing Wiesel's warning. For when we are indifferent, other people's lives become meaningless. Their visible anguish is of no interest. They become an abstraction, leaving us devoid of empathy. Being anti-racist means that we consciously and consistently choose love over indifference. I shudder with fear and I tremble with sadness when I read about the violence and rioting that continues to erupt throughout our country. I do not condone violence of any kind. However, I am empathetic to the struggle and fight of those rioting. I can understand that when people feel hopeless or that their lives literally do not matter to those in power, or when they can't breathe, that violence will result. We can help reduce violence of all kinds by seeing other people's suffering and working as a community to create a more equitable world. It is not enough to simply say that Black lives matter. We must do the work and transform our world so that Black lives do matter in every corner of society. This transformation happens not in the streets, but within each of us as we explore who we are and who we want to be by examining how our society functions and how it could function. Jews know this transformation so well. We do it every year on Yom Kippur. We engage in Cheshbon HaNefesh. We examine our actions from the past year in order to be better people in the next. Kol Nidre is perhaps the most powerful prayer in our tradition, and it focuses on the future. It speaks of the promises we make from this moment right now until this very moment next year, when we will, God willing, gather in person again. We'll recite the same prayers and we will recall the same ways that we have missed the mark. The beauty of Judaism is that it asks us not to be perfect. It only asks us that each of us continually strive for perfection. My hope on this Kol Nidre is that the rabbi of CMI in 2090, 70 years from today, does not quote my sermon from this evening, but instead speaks of the ways in which all people, regardless of race or religion, gender or sexuality, enjoys full equity and equality. May we commit ourselves to this task, and may we bring into our world more love, more peace, and more hope. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.